Of all the mods that can be done to a motorcycle engine, one of the most cost-effective changes you can make is installing a set of high-performance cams. As a general rule, especially among pushrod engines, and even more so with the Evolution Sportster engine, there's a lot of power left on the table on a stock engine. Stock camshaft grinds prioritize smooth operation, clean running, and a strong vacuum signal to help with carburation, which means factory cam grinds are often very short duration with an early intake close, particularly with the 2004 and later Sportster, which has a 25-degree intake close and only 215 degrees of intake duration. In this video, we're going to compare the stock decams that come in many Sportsters and Buells to the most popular bolt-in grind for rigid Sportsters, which is the Andrews N4. The cams I use are not the Andrews version of this cam, but the Screamin Eagle version, which is known as the Screamin Eagle .497 bolt-in cams. These cams are marked with a serial number that starts with 15-1 through 4 in the lobes. The N4 and the 497 cams are generally regarded as one and the same, which is noted in this chart at the bottom. Before we begin though, I'd like to quickly cover the difference between the stock cam grind and N4s and give you all a quick primer on what this stuff means and how it affects engine performance, and we'll start off with the most important spec, which is intake closing. Now, intake closing is the most important cam spec as it not only dictates the RPM range of the cam, but also dynamic compression. Dynamic compression is the actual cranking compression of the motor with the cams installed, and static compression is the raw number you'll see posted from the factory, and static compression is the raw number you'll see specified from the factory. For example, on 91-03 Sportsters, the factory compression ratio is 9:1, and for the Buell M2, it's 10:1. This number does not account for intake close of the cam, which is why the number is called static. It doesn't change. Let's use the W grind cam to illustrate how much of an effect intake closing has on compression. With a 25-degree intake close, the dynamic compression or corrected compression ratio is 9.67:1 with almost 210 psi of cranking compression. The W cam with 10:1 static compression requires very careful tuning to prevent detonation, as 210 psi is a healthy number. With a 46-degree intake close, which is what the N4 has, we can see that the corrected compression ratio is now down into the 8s at 8.93:1, with a cranking compression of 188 psi. That's a full 22 psi less cranking compression, which is a pretty large change. Now, what happens with a 56-degree intake close? The compression ratio is now 8.43:1, with a cranking compression of only 175 psi, which means we've now lost 1.3 points of compression, which would result in a large loss of low end torque without raising the static compression ratio. Let's briefly touch on duration. Duration is the amount of time that the valve stays open. Longer duration means the valve stays open longer. Increasing duration generally increases power, but too much duration, especially intake duration, negatively affects bottom end power, as more duration equals closing the intake valve later and later. Increasing duration also increases overlap, which is the amount of time that both the valves are open. Excessive overlap will cause a power loss if it can't be utilized. Now, lobe separation angle is the sum total of the intake and exhaust lobe centers added together and divided by 2. Generally, a numerically lower lobe separation angle will increase mid-range power and make the power band more narrow and punchy. Broader and numerically higher LSAs decrease overlap. They make the engine smoother and less lopey. They increase engine vacuum and can potentially make more top end power with a wider power band, though it depends on the engine. It's very common for old school pushrod V engines like the one in the Sportster to make more and more power the tighter you go on the LSA. The last thing we'll talk about is lift. Now, lift is the total distance that the valve is lifted off the seat, and if you have enough cylinder head flow to support it, more lift tends to increase top end power without losses anywhere else. But it isn't a catch-all. Cramming a bunch of lift into a cam with long duration will make for a steep, fast opening lobe, which requires a lot more valve spring. And running really high spring pressures beats up the valve train, so you find that most street cams on Harleys are low to medium lift, especially for the early Evo engines, as there's only enough clearance for about ½ inch of lift. Now that we have an understanding of what these specs mean, let's quickly compare the stock D cam to the N4 cam. The N4 has an intake close that's only 5 degrees later than the D cam, so you won't lose much cranking compression, and the RPM range will be similar to stock. The N4, however, has a lot more duration, 256 degrees on the intake and exhaust versus 223 for the D cam, which keeps the valve open a lot longer. The N4 also has 54 degrees of overlap, which is huge and makes exhaust selection very important. The N4 also has much tighter lobe centers, which results in a 101-degree lobe separation angle. This is 9 degrees tighter than stock, which will make this a punchy grind that hits hard at 3,800 to 4,400, with peak torque coming soon after. The total lift is only about 30 thousandths more with the N4, so mid-range and top-end gains will mostly come from increased duration and overlap rather than raw lift. The specs suggest that we'll likely see a loss in low RPM performance, with gains starting at around 3,400 RPM or so, and continuing to pull strong all the way to 6,800. Since we already have significant data on the 40 to 80, I wanted to do a test to illustrate the loss in torque, so here's what I did. There's two separate 40 to 80 tests. One where I start in first gear and do a first to third gear pull normally, and the second test will be starting at a lower RPM in third gear and doing the test without shifting. This will help us determine if there was a low RPM power loss. If the bike gets faster during the pull where we shift, but it doesn't improve on the single gear test, it means we lost a noticeable amount of low end power. Because the density altitude has been so much worse lately, and also because I added a much quieter muffler to the Buell since the last 40 to 80 test, I felt the best way to get a fair comparison was to redo the 40 to 80 test and get a new baseline with the D-cams, and the result of that test was the following two runs, 4.15 and 4.29. Now let's go ahead and show the single gear 40 to 80 test. 4.7 is actually a pretty solid number, and it caught me by surprise. It means the bike is making pretty significant torque to not lose very much time lugging the bike down low and staying in one gear. With the baseline data out of the way, I went ahead and swapped out the cams. Since the bike is going to be turbocharged, the owner opted to add in a bronze oil pump drive gear and add a high volume oil pump during the cam change. I also used this as an opportunity to poke a hole in the cam cover for the oil drain, so that the turbo will literally be a bolt-on affair that will only take a few hours to do once he's ready. Picking up 2/10 on the 40 to 80 test in worse conditions is a testament to the cams gaining power, and I have no doubt that once the DA is back down into the low 2000s, the bike could run 3.7 to 3.8s pretty consistently. The bike will power wheelie in second gear just by jumping on the throttle, and that's something it struggled to do with the D-cam. First gear is a riot now, and it will pick it up if you ask it to, no problem. In conclusion, I think it's fair to say that the cam did exactly what you'd expect. It lost a little power below 3000 RPM, and from about 3500 onwards it picked up horsepower and torque. The gains in the mid-range and top end were welcome, and the losses down at low weren't that noticeable. With the NA test on the books, I wanted to also share this back-to-back comparison we did on a customer's rubber mount Sportster with our turbo setup. This bike is a 2004 1200R, so it has the W-grind cams and 9.7 to 1 static compression. We baselined the bike stock, then with it turbocharged but with stock cams, and finally with Feuling 505/515 cams and 9 pounds of boost. It's worth noting that rubber mount Sportsters are close to 170 pounds heavier than tube frame Buells, and they also don't have the lightweight crankshaft or lightweight wheels that the Buells do, which is the reason the Sportster runs aren't super impressive until you put cams in it.
Alright guys, I don't know if you can see this, I'll throw it up on the screen. We did a 3.22.
As you can see, the cams had a profound change on the turbo bike, and the gains are over double with boost. This is because boost is a power multiplier. When you multiply a larger base number, the total amount of power gained is significantly more. So on an NA engine, if you gain 6 wheel horsepower from cams, you'll likely gain 10 to 12 wheel horsepower from cams even on low boost. Bottom line, adding cams completely alters the character of a motorcycle, and if you're willing to give up some bottom end power, adding cams to your build can completely change the way the bike feels for the better, and even more so if it's turbocharged. That's all for this one, patrons. I hope you enjoyed. We'll see you on the next one.